big story in politics. It is election night in Texas, where it is now election morning, and a legal battle is brewing over the U.S. Senate Democratic primary. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and State House Representative James Tallarico are locked in a close race. You see, Tallarico is ahead, but there is confusion over where to vote in some places, which prompted election officials to extend hours. Now the Texas Supreme Court has weighed in, saying those provisional ballots may not count. Meanwhile, the Republican candidates headed for a runoff. Neither incumbent Senator John Cornyn nor Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton got the required 50% of the vote, so they will go head-to-head in May. Let's go live to CNN's Jeff Zeleny, who is live in Austin, Texas. Jeff is live at the Tallarico campaign. Jeff, we just heard from him.
We did, Alex. Just a few moments ago, James Tallarico addressed his supporters who are now dwindling, but boy, did they stick this out for 5 or 6 hours here for him to appear on stage. And look, James Tallarico stopped short of declaring victory. However, his campaign is very confident of what they have been seeing all night long with these numbers. But instead, Tallarico said that every vote should be counted. He called out voter suppression, in his words, in his home county of Williamson County. And he said there were similar issues in Jasmine Crockett's hometown of Dallas. And he said those votes should be counted. But he also said that Texas sent an unmistakable message to the nation. He called it a hopeful message. So James Tallarico clearly is looking forward to running a much longer race here, looking forward toward the fall. It is mathematically very difficult for Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to make up that difference. But one of the reasons this race has not been called is there's enough election day vote out there in Dallas County, also in counties in many areas of Texas, that the race is not yet being projected. So James Tallarico effectively splitting the difference, again expressing confidence, stopping short of declaring victory, even as he calls on his message of economic populism. He said politics is not about left and right, it should be about top versus bottom. Clearly looking forward to trying to do something that Democrats have not done in Texas in a very long time, that is win a U.S. Senate seat. He was not born the last time that happened. Lloyd Bentsen in 1988 was the last Democratic U.S. Senator reelected here in Texas. He was born 1 year later. But for now, at least, this race will have to go on at least one more day until there are more votes that come in. But there is no question that James Tallarico believes he is on the verge of victory, at least, and will take on one of the Republican candidates who are now going to be locked in a runoff battle, Senator John Cornyn, of course, in the fight of his political life, seeking a 5th term versus Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. So, Alex, for now at least, this was the opening round of the midterm elections, and Democrats are hoping to get some enthusiasm and perhaps some guidance as they go forward about what type of candidates could win this year.
And Jeff, it's interesting. We're now listening to Selena Quintanilla, Selena singing behind you, recording, which is a reminder that the Latino vote came in big for James Tallarico, which was key to what appears to be a victory. We'll see. But what happens next in terms of the legal challenge? Where do we go from here, and when could we get a final result?
Well, that is a question that will likely be not resolved until the sun comes up. However, some votes are still being counted, and other counties go home and count them in the morning. So more election day vote needs to be added to all of the early vote. An extraordinary number, a record-setting number of early votes were cast here, some 1.4 million. So once more election day vote is counted, my guess is there will be a projection in this race. But that does not necessarily resolve all the legal issues. Congresswoman Crockett said that she is going to keep her options open. This Texas Supreme Court stepped in as well. We will have to see where this legal battle goes. But a bigger political question, Alex, is does this affect party unity at all going forward? Right. If Democrats are going to have even a chance at doing something that they have not done in a very long time, turn a seat blue, of course they'll have to be unified. But for now, at least, certainly a big night in Texas. And for James Tallarico, a fairly unknown figure at the beginning of this race, certainly is a well-known one, at least in Texas now.
Yeah, you're pointing out the fact that if Jasmine Crockett's supporters, especially her black supporters, feel like they have been disenfranchised, do they then not show up in November and sit this one out, making it almost impossible for Tallarico to win? We'll see potentially what happens in the next coming days, and the way the two of them talk about this could impact that. Jeff Zeleny, thank you for staying up late for us. Great to have you live after midnight in Austin. Let's bring in Jeremy Wallace, also staying up late for us, political writer for the Houston Chronicle. What a story for you. Jeremy, your big takeaway in terms of what's going on right now and sort of breaking down what's happening.
Yeah, well, look, first of all, we've never seen turnout like this in a midterm election in a primary season ever in Texas. We're already breaking all kinds of records, and it's because of that Democratic, primary, obviously. That Senate race really drew a lot of people. Well, look, Republicans had a huge turnout too, but combined, you see, we're breaking all these records. And look at what, Tallarico has done here. Jasmine Crockett did really well in Houston and Dallas so far, places where we thought that she was going to do well, and that was going to get her to the victory. But as y'all pointed out earlier, it's like, look what Tallarico did with the Latino vote. If you looked at what's happening in the Rio Grande Valley, what's happened in San Antonio, and even up into Austin, he's had just dominating performances there that really helped counterbalance everything that we thought were going to be Jasmine Crockett's strengths.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how messy the next few days gets, because earlier in the night, it seemed like Tallarico might have had sort of the perfect storm where he could win, and you have a situation where on the Republican side, it would get messy between the two of them. Months of them spending money, fighting each other, bringing each other down to give Tallarico a potential lane. What would be necessary for a Democrat to win Texas, the white whale for the Democrats for such a long time now?
Yeah, right. Look, the data tells us that it's a possibility. Look, I know people are looking at this last presidential race and saying, look, it was even close. Trump easily won. But you have to really go back to that 2018 midterm cycle. Remember, Beto O'Rourke lost by 215,000 votes. Since that time, we added 2.8 million voters to the voter rolls in Texas. And a lot of those people, most of them have been along the I-35 corridor, which I call the blue spine of Texas. That has become Democratic as it's gotten more diverse and more urban. So what Tallarico or Crockett, if she were somehow able to pull this off, what they have to do is look at this race as, okay, if Beto O'Rourke can get it within 215 and we have 2.8 million voters, the math tells you it's possible. You just have to have a good candidate. So what Tallarico needs to do is get that Hispanic excitement to continue on to the fall, but then he's going to have a reckoning with those supporters for Jasmine Crockett, as y'all were talking about. It's like he has to make sure they stay on board and they come out to vote, because that's the key. That's what made Jasmine Crockett such a good candidate for Democrats on the surface, was that she was going to be able to get people in Houston and Dallas to vote that haven't voted in years because of who she is and where she comes from. And Tallarico needs to figure out a way to get those people to stay on board.
And if it is, in fact, Tallarico, does Jasmine Crockett help with that? Will be an interesting thing to watch as well. Meanwhile, let's talk about what's going on with the Republicans. So you've got John Cornyn, this establishment leader in the Senate, who is being challenged by Ken Paxton, who has all sorts of legal problems. And yet it is really close. President Trump has not gotten involved so far. How do you see that going from here, and what side potentially do you think the president weighs in on, if he does?
Well, if I'm John Cornyn, I'm liking what the numbers look like right now. If he looks like he's the leader coming out of this primary, that's going to be really important for him to go to Trump and say, look, I'm the leader. You want to back the winner, right? Because we know Trump doesn't want to, endorse somebody who ends up losing. So if there's a chance to get a Trump endorsement in the runoff, Cornyn has to be ahead of Paxton. There's no way he's getting it if he's behind it. So he's already checked that box off, right? So that's a key component right there. But, and look, we're already hearing from, the Cornyn camp, or these people who are working with them, that they're going to bring even more negative attention to Ken Paxton. It's going to be a war. This is going to be, throw your TV in the garbage, because you're going to get so many TV ads in Texas from Houston to Dallas. No matter where you are, you're going to get pounded, when we get into this midterm, into the runoff.
And even if you don't live in Texas, the reason to care about this is there's basically no path for Democrats to win back the Senate if they don't win Texas, which is why this whole thing is so important, not only around the country, but around the world. Jeremy Wallace, thank you for staying up late, although you would have already been up, because what a crazy night in Texas politics. Yeah. Thank you so much. Great to talk with you.
You betcha. Thanks a lot.
We will have more on the military conflict in Iran when we come back. Still ahead, how U.S. lawmakers are reacting after a briefing from Trump officials late tonight. A live picture from Beirut, Lebanon, where it's 8:25 in the morning right now, and you see smoke rising over the Beirut suburbs. We just saw an attack there. It happened not long after Israel warned an urgent warning for residents to evacuate in the city's area. So the conflict continues throughout the Middle East right now. We want to get some perspective from one of the smartest guys in all of politics. Live in Los Angeles is Douglas Brinkley, a presidential historian and professor of history at Rice University. Welcome to The Story Is for the first time. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
What do we make of President Trump's decision to go to war with Iran? Put this moment in some historical context.
Well, the last time really is World War II, 1941, when a president went in front of the Congress, when FDR after Pearl Harbor, and we had a joint, session that said, yes, we're in this war. But since then, presidents are supposed to obey the War Powers Act, certainly since Vietnam, when that passed in 1973. But alas, Donald Trump is sort of ignoring the Constitution, ignoring the War Powers Act, and saying, I have presidential authority to do this. And so it's sort of a stark moment, but here in the United States, people want American men and women to succeed, but things are unraveling in a lot of different directions. And we can't forget World War I started with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, where things that seem small can grow. So hopefully this war, Operation Epic Fury, will be curtailed in days, weeks, hopefully not more than a month, because it's deadly and it's killing. Many people in Iran are dying, and people in Israel and elsewhere.
Certainly, President Trump is not the first president to engage in combat without seeking congressional approval. Think about President Obama with Libya and plenty of other examples as well. But overall, not only just this, can you think of any other president, certainly in our lifetime, that has had this expansive a view of executive power and of what the job of the presidency is?
No, there's nothing like Donald Trump's use of presidential authority. We're in America 250. We're celebrating our three branches of government, and Congress has been really cut out of this process. There isn't a consultation. It's what Donald Trump wants and does. Every president's been, in recent memory, has had an opportunity to bomb Iran. We had the hostage crisis with Jimmy Carter, and we worked through an entire year, eventually got the hostages back, but we didn't go to war. And every time there are these moments, people have hesitated, presidents, but not Donald Trump. He'd be the first to admit it. But this rings my 2003 bell with George W. Bush, because after 9/11, we debated in Congress, what to do, how to do it. But we had a shock and awe in 2003, where we went in and we're going to get rid of Saddam Hussein. We're going to bring democracy to Iraq. And in the end, we ended up having a long and historically unpopular engagement in the second Iraq war. I think I miss in some ways George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41, when Iraq had invaded Kuwait. They drew a line in the sand and built a coalition of NATO, coalition of the United Nations, and we went in with Operation Desert Storm and booted the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait and liberated it. So there are many ways to deal with Middle East policy, but going it in a bilateral way, U.S., Israel, just bombing Iran with no clear-cut way of putting the government back in and creating turmoil in the Middle East, it comes with a very high warning sticker on it, because this is serious. We're not this isn't Ronald Reagan in Grenada here. We're dealing with a tinderbox in the Middle East.
And lastly, is there a way for the presidency to go back to what it was? Or is sort of the genie out of the bottle? Has the presidency itself been changed forever?
I don't think the War Powers Act is relevant anymore. It came in 1973 out of Vietnam. We have to remember that Richard Nixon invaded, or did an incursion, as they used to call it, into Cambodia. That triggered Kent State, another domestic protest. And there was this thought that the War Powers Act was going to rein a president in. But alas, it has not worked. It's almost irrelevant, the War Powers Act now. So when we get out of this situation, I think the United States has to consider how to make sure presidents don't act in a unilateral, rogue fashion without consulting Congress in some way, shape, or form. Might be a new committee, new resolution, how to do this. But this isn't working right now. Donald Trump's just brushed the War Powers Act off his shoulders like it doesn't exist.
Douglas Brinkley, I am such a big fan of your writing, and it's an honor to have you on this broadcast for the first time. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective.
Thank you so much.
We are following the legal battle shaping up right now in Texas. Breaking news where confusion at the polls, extended voting hours have thrown the Democratic Senate primary into limbo. We've got a political panel joining us live to break down what's next right after this. We continue to follow breaking news in Texas, where the Democratic Senate primary appears to be in legal limbo. Election officials extended voting by 2 hours at some polling places after changes in the rules led to confusion about where to vote. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, State Representative James Tallarico locked in a tight race, but as you can see, Tallarico has the upper hand. Now the state Supreme Court says some of those late ballots may not be counted, which is not good news for Crockett. Tallarico addressed supporters a short time ago in Austin. He stopped short of declaring victory and said all votes need to be counted.
The number of Texans who have never voted before but showed up in this election is unprecedented. The number of independents and Republicans who voted in this Democratic primary is unprecedented. This is proof that there is something happening in Texas. Tonight, the people of our state gave this country a little bit of hope.
On the Republican side, CNN projects incumbent Senator John Cornyn and State Attorney General Ken Paxton are headed for a runoff. Neither candidate will reach the 50% threshold to win the race outright. Let's bring in our panel. Alicia Krause, conservative commentator and op-ed writer for the Washington Examiner, joining us from our home base in Los Angeles. And Maria Cardona with us, Democratic strategist and CNN political commentator. Ladies, welcome. Good to see both of you again. Maria, let's start with you, because right now the real action's on the Democratic side. What do you make of what's happening right now and the way that you read it, and you know the numbers so well? Is it Tallarico in the end?
Well, we have to wait until we have every vote counted. Like he said, everyone's voice must be heard. But you have shown the numbers. I do think it will be difficult for Jasmine Crockett to make up the difference. But let's wait and see until we see the final tally. But Alex, I think what is so exciting, no matter who wins, whether it's Tallarico, whether it's Jasmine Crockett in the end, what this has proven tonight is the massive enthusiasm that exists on the Democratic side for this election and for this election for change. And it's not happening just in Texas. And the fact that we're even talking about this at 1 a.m, Alex, as it's going to be huge news, because it is, I think tells you that something is changing, something is shifting across the country. Like Tallarico said, this has been massive turnout, incredible numbers never seen before. 200,000 more people showed up to vote in the Texas primary than in the Republican primary in a red state like Texas. We also had in Arkansas a Democrat flip a red seat from red to blue, and that is the 27th flip of a red seat to blue across the country in a state legislature in the last year, Alex. This shows you the kind of momentum that Democrats have, because they are sick and tired of what Trump and Republicans have brought on the American people: exploding costs, chaos, and corruption.
You say that, but Democrats haven't actually won a Texas Senate seat since for a generation or two. Alicia, of the two potential finalists, Jasmine Crockett and James Tallarico, who would be harder for you guys to run against?
I really think that it would be Tallarico. I mean, listen, as a conservative Christian who's from the Bible Belt myself, I think that he has said and done things that are blasphemous, to say the least. But I think that broadly his style is going to be more appealing to moderate and maybe like slightly right of center, not very engaged voters. And I think that he understands that his base is very different than his potential broader constituency. And we'll see him pivot after it's official that he's won the primary to kind of moderate himself a little bit and become more appealing to those voters. And I don't understand how Crockett can say that the election was stolen from her and threaten all these lawsuits when Texans have been voting for 3 weeks now. And like Tallarico mentioned, more Democrats turned out in this primary than Republicans did. If anything, she should be perturbed at her own party apparatus, from the liberal podcasters to, late night hosts and others who have been really trying to suppress her this entire time. I mean, I've been in awe of the left eating their own, specifically in this race, and maybe they need to sit down and have a little chit chat and figure things out before we get into a really contested primary like this.
Clearly there was some confusion and some problems with the voting, so much so that a judge granted them to keep the polls open for a couple hours. But let's not get into the weeds on that right now. Let's talk about what's happening on the Republican side, Alicia. You've got John Cornyn going into a battle with Ken Paxton. Ken Paxton has all sorts of legal problems and scandals in his background. John Cornyn has been an establishment favorite for years. The race is really close. How do you see it?
It's fascinating to me because Cornyn seems like the safe bet, like you called him an establishment guy, but he votes with Donald Trump the majority of the time. Ken Paxton is a lightning rod, but not in a good way. I mean, the guy's been impeached. He's been investigated for fraud and bribery. One of the things was like bribing his mistress or bribing a donor to give money to his mistress. It's insane. And I think that he kind of thinks that he's MAGA light or Trump like, but we've seen time and time again, and I would warn the Republican voters in Texas that unfortunately when we choose a kind of in persona Trump like candidate, it doesn't bear well for us in the general election. And I think if Paxton wins this runoff, because they needed to meet the threshold of 50% plus one and obviously didn't, it's not going to be good for Republicans, and we could lose that seat.
Do you agree with that, Maria? Is Cornyn a tougher opponent for Democrats?
You know what? I actually don't, because from everything that I have seen and folks that I have talked to in Texas, if Cornyn wins, the MAGA base is not going to turn out for him because they love Paxton. And so if you want to look at a party who is eating their own, I think you can look at the Republican Party. The ads that were run from by Cornyn's team against Paxton were just brutal. Yeah, they were true. And the fact that Republicans are looking to nominate someone like Paxton, I think is gross and disgusting. And it will, I think, make it easier for Democrats to win. But at the same time, even if it is Cornyn, like I mentioned before, Alex, people have had it. Texans have had it with Trump and Republicans, even those who voted for Trump in 2024, including some of Black voters, including Latino voters, who are now running back to the Democratic Party because Trump has betrayed them on issues of costs, immigration, the chaos, the corruption. They have had it. And that they are making their voices heard through this election.
We will see. That was a message that Beto O'Rourke said and Colin Allred said. A whole lot of money was pumped into those campaigns. They were not able to get over the finish line. We'll see if it is James Tallarico, if this is going to be different this time around. Maria, Alicia, thank you for staying up late with us tonight. We really appreciate it. What an interesting race. Again, Texas could determine the U.S. Senate control. The Democrats probably can't get there without flipping Texas. Thank you, ladies. We'll see. We'll see you later.
Thanks, Alex.
We're going to continue our breaking news from all around the world. And here is a live picture right now from Beirut. This just happened during our conversation. Another explosion in that region. We will go back to the Middle East for more live coverage right after this. Iran has now targeted the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East. That is the Al Udeid Air Base, which Qatar says was struck by an Iranian ballistic missile on Tuesday. There were no casualties. Let's bring in CNN senior producer Bijan Hussein, who is standing by right now live in Doha. Bijan, what are you seeing on the ground in Doha?
Hi, Alex. Yeah, a lot of developments that happened overnight. Let's start with that missile that you just referred to. It did, in fact, get through. We got confirmation of that from Qatar's Ministry of Defense hitting El Udeid. As you said, no injuries reported. We know El Udeid is the largest U.S. base here in the region. Normally, it would house some 10,000 personnel. About 6 weeks ago, when tensions started to flare up between Iran and the U.S., we saw some evacuations of non-essential military personnel taking place at that base. But contrary to that, we also saw a military equipment buildup. We saw air refuelers and air transporters making their way into country over here. But also overnight, we heard from Qatar's state-run news agency that authorities detained 10 people, 10 suspects, 2 separate cells that they say were acting on behalf of the IRGC. That's Iran's Revolutionary Guard. They say that 7 of them were given tasks on gathering information on key military facilities, on both government and national facilities. And also 3 of them were given what they say are sabotage tasks, and that they were trained in the use of drones. We also know that authorities, at least according to Qatar's state-run agency, authorities found on these people key locations and coordinates of sensitive facilities, as well as communication devices and technological equipment.
Bijan, thank you so much for your reporting in Doha. We'll see you with more in our next hour, but we want to talk about the economy now. U.S. oil prices reached their highest level in more than a year on Tuesday before retreating. Brent crude, global benchmark, gained more than 4.5% to top $81 a barrel. Now it's about $80. Prices eventually cooled down after President Trump announced he has ordered insurance and other guarantees for oil, for energy, and other maritime trade in the Middle East. We want to go now live to Hong Kong. That's where CNN's Christy Lou Stout is following the markets. Christy, welcome back to The Story Is. The global energy shock is battering the markets. How is global shipping caught in the crosshairs?
You know, Alex, as the conflict in Iran widens, global shipping rates are absolutely surging. In fact, supertanker rates in the Middle East have reached all-time highs, and that has prompted both the United States and China to step in to call for more protections and safeguarding of vessels and ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, the strait is that very narrow channel right off the coast of Iran through which 20% of the world's oil consumption flows through, as well as a significant amount of liquefied natural gas. It was during this week, as reported, Iran issued that threat, warning that it would attack any vessel that would dare to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And a number of vessels and ships in the area have been hit by strikes during this ongoing conflict. In fact, if you look at the real-time mapping data on marinetraffic.com, you would see that the Strait of Hormuz is virtually empty. And it's fears that this situation will persist. That is what's been moving the market. markets. It's sending share prices down. It's sending the cost and the price of oil up, the price of gas up, even safe haven investments, gold, the U.S. dollar surging as well. And that's why the two world powers, the United States and China, are stepping in, trying to stabilize the markets. We did hear recently from Beijing, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, its spokesperson, Mao Ning, addressed the conflict in the daily press briefing that took place on Tuesday afternoon. And I think we have the statement for you, but she said this, quote, China urges all parties to stop the military operations at once, to avoid further escalation, to keep the shipping routes in the Strait of Hormuz safe, and prevent further impact on the global economy. And the U.S. President Donald Trump has gone one step further, offering shipping insurance, offering shipping guarantees, and also offering quite the pledge. He took to his social media platform of choice. Of course, that's Truth Social, occasionally using all caps, declaring this, no matter what, the United States will ensure the free flow of energy to the world. And Donald Trump also said that the U.S. Navy would escort oil tankers in the Gulf. Now, the details here are unclear, but China would have the most to gain here. China, of course, is the world's biggest importer of crude. China is the biggest buyer of Iranian oil, and China would certainly welcome U.S. Navy escorts of oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. Back to you, Alex.
Christy, thank you. We want to get some big breaking news in the world of politics. CNN now projecting that James Tallarico will win the Democratic primary and advance after a tough and close fight against Jasmine Crockett. But James Tallarico will advance to the general election. The Republican primary is now not at a place where there will now be a runoff in the Republican primary with John Cornyn or Ken Paxton, but whoever wins that will face James Tallarico, the Texas representative, is advancing. That is the breaking news. We will have more news here on The Story Is when we come back. The war with Iran and that breaking news out of Texas. More of The Story Is, a special extra hour next.
This is CNN Breaking News.
And welcome to a special third hour of The Story Is. I'm Alex Michelson, live from CNN headquarters in Atlanta. We're following two big breaking stories. We start, though, in the world of politics. It is election night in Texas, and CNN just moments ago projecting that James Tallarico will win the hotly contested Texas Senate Democratic primary against Jasmine Crockett. James Tallarico advancing to the next round. The other big story at this hour is the intensifying war with Iran. And let's begin in the Middle East, where the U.S. and Israel's war now entering day 5. Just moments ago, we could see smoke in the southern suburbs of the Lebanese capital of Beirut. Several explosions that we witnessed within the last hour. All that coming after the Israeli military issued an urgent warning for residents to get out of the area, claiming they were in close proximity to Hezbollah facilities. Now, hours ago, Israel launched what it called a new broad wave of strikes against Iran. They have targeted what the IDF described as command centers used by Iran's domestic security apparatus. A U.S.-based human rights group says more than 1,000 people, including children, have been killed in Iran since the war there began on Saturday. Meanwhile, concerns are now growing across the region about the stockpile of weapons needed to defend against Iranian attacks. Sources tell CNN that at least one U.S. Gulf ally is already running low on crucial munitions used to defense against those Iranian missiles and all the drones that Iran have been sending up in the air as well. Now, all this as the Trump administration is touting a number of early successes in the conflict while also trying to get its messaging straight on why it went to war in the first place. President Trump also facing scrutiny over the fact that U.S. citizens are now trapped in the Middle East days after the U.S. and Israel launched the first strikes.
On the same page in terms of
why wasn't there an evacuation plan, and will you send planes to get people out?
Well, because it happened all very quickly. We thought, and I thought maybe more so than most, I could ask Marco, but I thought we were going to have a situation where we were going to be attacked. They were getting ready to attack Israel. They were getting ready to attack others. You're seeing that right now. And a lot of those missiles that are hitting in, those are stationary. Those were aimed there for a long period of time at these other countries. So I think I was right about that. We attacked first.
CNN has team coverage live around the world right now. Paula Hancock standing by in Dubai. But let's start things off with Oren Lieberman live in Tel Aviv. Oren, it seems like the Israeli military is busy right now.
Absolutely, on two fronts. First, in Iran, where, as you pointed out, the Israeli military has conducted airstrikes against what it says are command and control elite force within the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as well as other targets. They've gone after the IRGC, they've gone after the regime itself and its mechanisms, its compounds, its facilities, and they continue to strike ballistic missile arrays and launchers. There have been more of those incoming overnight, or at least warnings of those, two in Jerusalem, one in the early morning hours and one just several hours ago. Many of those have been intercepted, especially in the last day or two. But earlier in this war, which is only 5 days old now, some of those were able to get through. Regardless, Israel continues to strike Iran at a furious pace, a conflict that, even if it's not intensifying as we speak, is already and remains very intense. At the same time, Israel is also striking Dahya in Beirut, that Israel views as a Hezbollah stronghold, and now they say they're going after Hezbollah infrastructure. Lebanese state media saying at least one residential building has been hit in Beirut, with several killed there. We have reached out to the Israeli military for comment. For Israel, this is an ongoing, effectively simultaneous war on two fronts as they try not only to take out the Iranian regime, and they've taken out its leadership, but are now going after from the top down, essentially, but also trying to disarm and take out Hezbollah. The Israeli military chief said just yesterday they wouldn't stop in Lebanon until Hezbollah was fully disarmed.
Yeah, and Oren, yesterday the Israeli military struck the compound in Iran where they believed that the vote was being held for the next supreme leader. What more do you know about that, and who was potentially killed?
That was a strike on the holy city of Qom, on what's called the Assembly of Experts, an 88-member council of senior clerics that's supposed to vote and meet to pick the next Iranian supreme leader. Israel believed they were striking that compound as the vote was happening, and even some officials had expressed some optimism that they had hit their target, that they had killed at least some members of that council. Iranian state media, however, said that the council itself was meeting virtually, and none of the members were in the building, or at least not a large number of them. At this point, it's still unclear, but a short time ago, Defense Minister Israel Katz from Israel said no matter who is picked as the next Iranian supreme leader, Israel considers him a legitimate target and will continue to pursue him. So Israel not just going for the current regime change, but trying to make sure there's no mechanism by which it can pick its own future.
And wouldn't you think at this point it would be smart for Iran to be meeting virtually?
It would seem that way, which is why we were kind of surprised by the first reports that they struck while they were meeting. And again, Iranian state media says they had been meeting virtually. Look, I think Israel's intelligence on Iran has been exquisite, I would say, at this point since the beginning of the conflict. But we're now on day 5 as Israel moves down that target list that it says it's developed over the past several months.
And of course, sometimes we have the fog of war after some of these attacks. Oren Lieberman in Tel Aviv, continuing his great reporting for us. Thank you, Oren. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says all personnel are accounted for after a drone struck a parking lot near the U.S. consulate in Dubai. Paula Hancock is live in Dubai with more on that. Paula.
Yes, Alex, the U.S. consulate in Dubai, not far from here, that was targeted. We understand it was the parking lots are just close to the building itself. Now, we understand that there have been no casualties, no one hurt. There was no one there at the time. We know that the consulate here in Dubai, the embassy in Abu Dhabi, had already been closed. They had said that they wouldn't be at least taking appointments until March 4th, so until today. That's clearly going to change now that the consulate consulate itself has been targeted, but they say that there was also a CIA station in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia that has been targeted. We understand there's significant damage to that building, but again, no casualties. And also 2 cruise missiles were targeting an area near Al-Khaj in Saudi Arabia. It's close to a Saudi military base, but it's one that we know US military aircraft have been using in the past. And in Kuwait, we know that there have been overnight strikes as well. In fact, there was several projectiles that were intercepted by officials. They say the debris of one of those interceptions hit a residential building and killed an 11-year-old girl. So the incoming is continuing to these Gulf nations. In fact, just about 10 minutes ago, we heard 2 interceptions overhead here in Dubai. We've heard from the Revolutionary Guards in Iran that they are expanding their scope when it comes to what is on their target list, saying that also American political centers are now going to be targeted, not just the military targets. Although, as we know, certainly here in Dubai, there is far more than military targets and political centers being targeted. We have seen hotels, we have seen city centers, we've seen energy infrastructure around the region being targeted as well. Alex?
Yeah, when you joined us about 24 hours ago at this time, there had just been an interception before your live shot, and again, that happening once again 24 hours later. What have you seen in terms of that in the last 24 hours, just personally being there? What have you seen? What have you heard?
Well, it's interesting because much of what we are hearing from officials is quite staggering when you hear the numbers. I mean, obviously, we hear the interceptions overhead. We see certain areas being impacted, but when you hear the numbers, it's impressive. I mean, more than 1,000 missiles, drones, cruise missiles have been fired towards the UAE. The UAE really does appear to have been singled out by Tehran as the main target in these Gulf nations. You see Kuwait fairly close behind as well, with more than 500 missiles and drones. Here in the UAE, though, at this point, the air defense systems are doing what they should be doing. As we can understand it, more than 90% is being intercepted. There have been 3 deaths here. We understand some injuries as well. I can hear fighter jets overhead at this moment as well. What we have been hearing is definitely a more significant fighter jet activity in the air today and yesterday. So we're not necessarily seeing the number of missiles incoming that we saw certainly in the first 2 days, and that is reflected in the numbers officials are giving us, but certainly drones are very high. Here in the UAE, more than 800 drones have been fired, and we're on day 5. Alex?
And an impressive showing from the defense of the UAE as well, knocking all those down. And we're grateful for your safety that is happening. Paula Hancock's in Dubai. Be safe. Thank you for this. Now we want to go to our breaking news in the political world here in America. And that projection in the most closely watched race in the country that just came within the last 10 minutes, that projection, that state representative James Tallarico will win the Democratic Senate primary, defeating Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. There's been confusion throughout the last few hours, confusion over where to vote, led election officials to extend their hours at some locations. It's not clear if those late votes will count. Crockett has threatened legal action, but according to CNN's data, even if they counted, it would not be enough for Crockett to make up the difference that Tallarico is going to win this thing either way. The situation on the Republican side, not entirely settled. Incumbent Senator John Cornyn is headed to a May runoff with State Attorney General Ken Paxton. You need to get 50% to move on. Neither one did, so there will be a runoff between the top 2, Cornyn and Paxton. We want to bring back Jeremy Wallace, political reporter for the Houston Chronicle. You joined us last hour, but since you joined us last hour, there is now a projection in this race. James Tallarico moving on. Your reaction to that news?
Yeah, it's really amazing news when you think of it. He had to come from so far back at one point. He had to like slowly get back in the polls. When Jasmine Crockett got in the race back in December, she kind of set the world on fire. And remember, she was all of a sudden leading in the polls. Money was coming in everywhere. She had all the support, kind of building around her, and it looked like she had a pathway. But he kept, going. He didn't back out of the race like, former U.S. Rep Colin Allred did. He stuck in it, and he kept plowing away. And for him to overcome the numbers that she has put up in places like Houston and in Dallas and still win, it defies some of the core basics of the Democratic playbook in Texas. It's like you're supposed to win those two areas and then win the nomination. Well, Jasmine Crockett just won those two areas, and she's not going to get the nomination because of the Valley, because of San Antonio, and because of places like Tarrant County and Travis County. The big numbers for Tallarico in all those places.
And what a contrast in styles between the two of them. Crockett literally entered the race with an ad showing how against Donald Trump she was. Tallarico, not as partisan, at least blatantly so, trying something very different.
Yeah, right. It's like you could see, he was almost taking a little bit of a page from Beto O'Rourke's old playbook back in 2018 when he came so close to beating Ted Cruz. Remember, he was like, less about, this is about Ted Cruz. It's not about fighting Ted Cruz. It's about giving people something to vote for. And I think you saw a little bit of that kind of reflected in what Tallarico was trying to present himself as. It was less about, fighting Donald Trump and, more, like, what can we do together? That kind of same philosophy. And as you mentioned, Crockett came in this with like, okay, you guys want somebody who wants to fight. You want somebody who's going to fight and stand up to all members of Congress, no matter who they are, right? And she, perfectly fit that bill. But clearly, in the end, Tallarico was able to, win over a lot of people. It's interesting because we're almost this tale of two states at this point. If you look at people east of I-35, it's like you'll see a lot more votes for Crockett, and those along I-35 and further out west, it starts becoming more Tallarico, and that kind of tells you who won this time.
So the Democrats haven't had a winning senator in Texas since Lloyd Benson, which is before a lot of our viewers were even alive. So what does a successful Democratic coalition look like? And does that mean independents and Republicans? Do you need to win some of them over to get there?
Yeah, you're definitely going to have to win some of the, but you got to think of the independents in Texas are look, Texans by their nature were distrustful of government, of politics, of big businesses. In that kind of way, if you go out into the countryside of Texas, people want to hear that message, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. And so there's a lane there for Tallarico to kind of use that populist message that similarly like Bernie Sanders, you heard him, when he got, he was doing pretty well in Texas at one point. It was because of that message, so Tallarico has a potential there, but he's got to, do what he's just did, which is win really big in the Valley and really do well with Hispanic voters. Then he has to figure out the big problem, which is how are you going to excite the black voters of Houston and Dallas who are really clearly super energized by Jasmine Crockett? Can he keep them in the fold? That's going to be the key to this whole thing. If you can bring those two elements together with the general changing nature of the state, as I mentioned before, we've added 2.8 million additional voters since 2018. Y'all, this is not the same state. We basically added the entire state of Connecticut in the middle of all of this stuff. So, you can see it's just added a volatility to the election cycle that both Republicans and Democrats know is dangerous, at least the ones who are paying attention.
What's the nature of their relationship, Jasmine Crockett and James Tallarico? Do you see her being helpful to him? Do you see folks that endorsed her, like Kamala Harris, or maybe somebody like Barack Obama getting involved? Because this has potential to be one of, if not the most high-profile Senate race in the country, because the Democrats probably cannot get there in terms of winning back the Senate if they don't flip this seat.
Yeah, that's what they're going to need. They're going to need an intervention from people on the outside maybe to do it. But look, Tallarico and Jasmine Crockett were actually in the Texas House at the same time. So they already are a little familiar with each other. It's not like they're complete strangers. Look, this campaign got a little, messy at times, but not really super negative like it got into a personal nature. So I think there's enough to kind of rebuild back. This isn't like one of those scorched earth primaries that they're coming out of. The question is, just can they get that excitement back together? So certainly, there's going to be a lot of outreach to Jasmine Crockett saying, hey, there's no way Tallarico is going to win this thing unless you bring your full spirit and energy into this. And I think that's where you're going to have people like Kamala Harris, maybe a Barack Obama, like you mentioned, kind of sitting everybody down and saying, look, we got to think about what's bigger for the team at this point. It's like at this point, getting everybody together in the Democratic Party in Texas is the only way that you can even have a shot. Before you even start talking about trying to pull over some Republicans, you got to get the whole Democratic base together. And that's just something we really haven't seen in Texas since that 2018 U.S. Senate run that Beto O'Rourke had.
And he got a lot of people together and raised a lot of money and then came up short. And so we'll see if history repeats itself. A lot of that's going to be dependent on who the Republicans run, which we don't know. That's going to be a whole other discussion. Jeremy Wallace, thank you so much for joining us again on this breaking news. We want to continue our breaking news coverage right now with Jeff Zeleny of CNN, who is live in Austin, Texas on the phone shortly after leaving that event covering James Tallarico throughout this process. Jeff, your reaction to this breaking news CNN projection that James Tallarico pulls it out in the end?
Well, look, this really is certainly something that Democrats have had their eye on this Texas Senate race. And James Tallarico, who did basically come out of nowhere, at least nationally speaking, but such a rising star in the view of many, now could Democrats actually have a shot at Texas? So it really opens up also a bit of a challenge for Democrats and a bit of a question, Alex. How much money are Democrats willing to invest in Texas? It is always the race for so long, the one that just gets away for Democrats in Senate races. Think Beto O'Rourke most recently and many others. But for this moment, at least, I think that our great colleague at the Houston Chronicle was just saying, I think unifying the party is the big challenge. There's no doubt. But Republicans, this is going to be this is going to give John Cornyn a bit of a boost because he, of course, is running in a runoff, and he is going to make the argument that with James Tallarico on the Democratic side, if Ken Paxton is the Republican nominee, Democrats could lose that seat. And it's an argument that many Republicans in Washington actually think has some credence. So for several different levels, as you were saying, on the Democratic side, it offers a bit of a roadmap for the party in terms of what type of brand the Democratic Party is going to become. But in terms of the real math of the Senate, it's going to make the rest of the next 8 months here very interesting.
Yeah, it's been very interesting privately how many sources have said to you, me, and so many others that they were much more scared to run against James Tallarico than Jasmine Crockett. They thought that Jasmine Crockett would be easy to defeat for the Republicans, but that James Tallarico would potentially be problematic. We will see what happens next. Jeff, thank you for your exhausting long hours on this. We appreciate you staying up late and covering this breaking news. It's been great watching your coverage all throughout the process.
It's my pleasure, Alex. One quick thing to look at. Will this make Trump get into the race faster? I think it might. So keep your eye on that.
Which way? Which way does he go, though?
Well, we'll see about that. But don't forget that two of his top campaign allies are working on behalf of John Cornyn. So this is going to certainly make his decision an interesting one.
Yeah, Chris LaCivita, his campaign manager, and his pollster, both working for John Cornyn. They have a direct line to Donald Trump. Thank you, Jeff. We got more on what's happening in Texas and what's happening in Iran. Our breaking news coverage all over the world continues right after this. U.S. lawmakers remain largely divided along party lines on President Trump's end goals for the U.S. military action in Iran. This despite Tuesday's briefing from top administration officials.
Did you get an explanation about what the end game is here?
There's no explanation as to what actually prompted the decision to pursue this war of choice in the absence of any evidence that there was an imminent threat to the United States of America or American interests in the region.
To me, this is a no-brainer. They had a window of opportunity to take out very specific military assets in order to defang the Iranian regime. We will be safer as a result. However, if it goes beyond that, they need to come to Congress.
How do you know that the next regime that may come in may not be more hardline than the last regime?
I bet somebody asked in 1935, what happened if we killed Hitler? God, I wish we'd have known. It will only get better.
That is a live picture from the Senate where we saw Manu Raju talking earlier with those folks. The Senate set to vote as soon as Wednesday on a war powers resolution that will require President Trump to gain congressional approval to continue the military campaign. The House is supposed to vote on a similar measure Thursday. Both are likely to fail. Even if they pass, President Trump would veto them. Brian Todd is live with us from Washington. Brian, talk to us about the Americans who are stuck in the Middle East right now with no real way to evacuate.
Alex, thousands of them are stuck. They don't have a way to evacuate. They're not getting great communication, and they are very frustrated, and frankly, they're very scared. Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said he's confident that the U.S. is going to be able to get all of its citizens out of that region who want to get out, but they did not have a plan before the airstrike started, and they're playing catch up at the moment. Rubio saying that they're looking at military aircraft and charter flights to try to get them in there, to get Americans out. They want people to register at step.state.gov so that they can communicate with people to get them the word on how they can evacuate. But again, they're scrambling to try to make that happen. And a telephone number that Marco Rubio gave out earlier for Americans who want assistance to call the State Department. This is a recording that they heard earlier.
If you are calling about the crisis in the Middle East, please press 1. If not, press 2. Please do not rely on the U.S. government for assisted departure or evacuation at this time. There are currently no United States evacuation points. Please continue to check the embassy's website for updated information. In the event of ongoing military action,
I called that same number a short time ago. I did get a live person on the line. I asked her about possibly evacuating an American from, let's say, Saudi Arabia. She said there are no evacuations going on. She said to go to step.state.gov, where they're telling Americans in Saudi Arabia, at least, to shelter in place. So not offering really any way out there. Here are a couple of quotes, Alex, that you'll just find astounding from Americans. One unnamed American told CNN, quote, "I feel like a sitting duck in the region." A gentleman named Forrest Harrington, a U.S. citizen who is stuck in Dubai, said, quote, "It would be hilarious if it wasn't so frustrating." Harrington said he was supposed to have only a short layover in Dubai off a trip coming back from a work trip in India. Here's what he said, though, quote, "The UAE government has housed and fed me since I got here, and I've received nothing from my own government." He's not getting any updates either. He's been stuck in Dubai. A lady named Katie, didn't want to give her last name. She is an American stuck in Bahrain. Here are some quotes from her. Quote, "The State Department tells me to evacuate, but there's no way to do so. I was just supposed to have a short layover, and now I'm here for the indefinite future, getting more and more trauma by the day." End quote. Just a few accounts, Alex, from Americans stuck in the region, very, very frustrated, very confused, and frankly, a lot of them are scared. How long are they going to be there? Is the U.S. government going to contact them? When their efforts to contact the U.S. government by phone and even online are just seemingly met with frustration.
Yeah, well, that message you played, just not good enough if you're stuck in that region. Brian Todd, staying up late with us in Washington tonight. Thank you. A live picture from Doha, where it is now Wednesday morning. We will be going to that region for an update next. We're tracking developments in the war with Iran. Qatar now says it's arrested 10 people with suspected links to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard. And Bahrain's government is calling Iran's attack on an American military base in its capital treacherous. CNN senior producer Bijan Hosseini live in Doha with more. Bijan.
Hi, Alex. How are you? Yeah, the team here, we did see some of those interceptions taking place last night, or sorry, rather, we heard those interceptions taking place last night. We know at least one of those missiles did get through and hit El Udeid Air Base. That was confirmed to us by Qatar's Ministry of Defense. Obviously, El Udeid, a very significant U.S. base, normally housing 10,000 military personnel. We know about 6 weeks ago, they started evacuating some of the non-essential military personnel, but we also saw a buildup of equipment at that base happening over the last 4 weeks. Air transporters and air refueling jets that were brought in there. We also, you mentioned earlier, these arrests that we've heard from Qatar state news agencies citing authorities. 2 cells linked and working on behalf of the IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard. We know that 7 of those, according to authorities, 7 of those detainees were sent to gather information on key facilities and infrastructure, and that the other 3, according to authorities, were given these roles of sabotage and that they were trained in the use of drones. Authorities also added to that statement that these people who were detained had information on them. They had coordinates and key locations of sensitive facilities, as well as communication devices and technological equipment. Alex?
Our thanks to Bijan Hosseini from Doha. Still to come, airspace across some Middle Eastern countries remains on lockdown, making it nearly impossible to enter or leave the area. Peter Greenberg live with more on the travel chaos next. A live picture from Beirut, Lebanon. Breaking news, yet another explosion in Beirut. Over the last couple hours, we have seen multiple examples of this. Israel warning people in the area that they might strike. You see how close this particular incident is to the airport. You can see right there as well. And speaking of that, the travel nightmare is continuing for people around the world. Large parts of the Middle East have closed off their airspace due to conflict. You can certainly see why they would want to do that in Beirut right now. Some travelers have been stranded for days since there are limited flights going to or from the region. Some major airlines like Emirates and Virgin Atlantic have resumed limited flights out of the affected areas. Countries across Europe are working to evacuate their citizens as conflict escalates. Secretary of State of the United States, Marco Rubio, says the U.S. is also actively trying to secure evacuation flights.
We have identified and continue to identify charter flights, military flight options, and expanded commercial flight options, meaning working with the airlines to send bigger airplanes with more seats.
Joining me now live from Los Angeles is Peter Greenberg, a travel expert and travel editor at CBS News. Peter, good to see you. What are my options if I'm watching right now from the Middle East? I'm stranded. What do I do?
Well, there are some connections that you can do through the ground, meaning into Jordan. That airspace is being opened on a limited basis. You already heard about Dubai. Critical for them to keep that airspace open there because Emirates is only based there, and their flight operations were completely shattered over the last 48 hours. So they're starting to reopen the airspace at about 3 hours or 4 hours at a time during daylight hours and on a limited basis. Other than that, you don't have many options. You know, you mentioned the State Department trying to get charter flights in. What they're not telling you is whether or not insurance companies are writing policies for the very airlines they're trying to charter, if they're going to continue to insure those airlines, if they determine this is an act of war. Once that does that, those insurance policies become void during that time.
And if they're void, then what happens?
They're not going to fly. Same thing with cruise lines, same thing with ships trying to transit the Suez Canal, same thing with other countries like Egypt. If the insurance companies won't write the policies, or it's an exclusion in their policy that if it's an act of war, you're not going to be covered, what airline or cruise line or shipping company is going to put their vehicles at risk if they're not covered? So that's one of the concerns they're having right now.
Okay, so that's the situation if you're on the ground in the Middle East. There are people that are watching us right now from Europe where they're waking up. They're watching in the United States, and they want to go somewhere else that's not the Middle East. What are the ripple effects of all this in terms of travel disruption?
Well, if you take a look at just the Gulf countries alone, Qatar, Dubai, and Abu Dhabi, if you take a look at their traffic flow, 80% of the passengers who fly to those countries are not going to those countries anyway. They're actually flying through those countries. So the connectivity here is what's being disrupted, meaning you can't get anywhere else on those airlines through those countries. And that means other limited service is also affected.
What rights do you have as a passenger if your travel is disrupted or canceled, especially at a time of war?
Well, it's a force majeure situation in the contracted carriage of the airline. Basically, you're not going to get compensation and you're not going to get priority. It's beyond the airline's operational control. Same thing with weather, as you can imagine. But in a situation like this, the companies can claim, and they will claim, that this is an act of war, and therefore they're under no requirement to get you out, simply because they have to cease their operations. Now, when that happens, it becomes critical to reopen that airspace because the economic impact here is severe in an exponential way. So there's every reason to believe that they're going to try to reopen the airspace before Friday, because otherwise the economic losses alone will be staggering. You may remember after 9/11, air service was grounded for 5 days. They flew on the 6th. When the volcano erupted in Iceland, air service was disrupted for about 5 days. The airlines flew on the 6th. So the countdown is continuing to see if that pattern will be repeated here.
And then what does that look like if they're able to restore it? What could people expect?
Well, let's assume they reopen the airspace tomorrow. That doesn't mean the airlines are going to fly. Their planes are out of sequence. Their crews are out of rotation. It'll take them about 36 hours to get the planes back with the flight crews back into the sequence and the schedule. So you can count on about 36 hours from the time they reopen the airspace to the time they can actually start operating.
Nobody knows this issue better than Peter Greenberg. It's always a privilege to talk with you. Thank you so much for joining us live from Los Angeles.
You got it.
Our coverage continues in just a moment. The war in the Middle East is disrupting global markets, oil supplies, international shipping. We're looking at more video from the region now. A live report next. The war in the Middle East is causing oil prices to surge. U.S. oil prices reached their highest level in more than a year on Tuesday before retreating. Brent crude, the global benchmark, gained more than 4.5%. The top $81 a barrel. Now it's closer to $80. Prices eventually cooled down after President Trump announced new steps aimed at easing supply disruptions in the Middle East. The president says he has ordered insurance and other guarantees for oil, energy, and other maritime trade in the region. Live now to CNN's Eleni Giokos, who is following the markets from Abu Dhabi. Eleni, what are you seeing?
Yeah, Alex, and as you say, you've got that oil price, which clearly has been rising, and that's on the back of two main things. And these are massive risks. Firstly, you mentioned the Strait of Hormuz. There's major disruptions. You have the Iranian Revolutionary Guard saying there isn't going to be a drop of oil that is going to pass through the strait, where you normally see around 20 million barrels of oil on vessels that head mostly to Asia, and of course temper what we're seeing in terms of the oil price. That scenario has dramatically shifted, and as you say, President Trump posted this on social media overnight, and importantly saying that he's going to offer support, and importantly, if required, the Navy, the U.S. Navy, is going to assist in getting vessels through the strait, and also insurance premiums, which have frankly rallied. I was speaking to Lloyd's Intelligence a short while ago, and they were telling me about how normally during times of conflict or geopolitical tension, insurers will up their premiums to 3% of the value of the vessel. They don't know how President Trump and this policy is going to be implemented, and frankly, we haven't seen a shift on that pricing, but the point is to try and get supply through. I also want to show you the other big issue, and this is critical energy infrastructure that has been affected by Iranian strikes, and it basically shows from Oman at Duqm Port to here in the UAE in Fujairah that we've seen a fire because of shrapnel and because of the interceptions to Aramco, Saudi Aramco. That that refinery, and importantly, that LNG facility in Qatar, which has forced the Qataris to stop total production. That has seen prices surging from the gas price in Europe to what we see on the oil market as well, and frankly, major repercussions across the board. And we know President Trump has an aversion to high oil prices because that means the American voter is going to get affected. And this is at a time where he wanted to see a drop in inflation. He wanted to see a drop in interest rates. This scenario, of course, counter to everything he had planned on the economy front.
Yeah, and he wants to see a drop in gas prices as well, Eleni. So let's talk about what we're seeing in Asia right now, a bit of a bloodbath. Why are we seeing such big losses?
It is. I mean, it's a bloodbath. And frankly, you know, analysts are saying it perhaps is partly a correction in the market where there was a lot of excitement about AI and digital transformation and building of data centers. And specifically what we see in South Korea, the Kospi plunging 12% in today's session. And of course, South Korea is always very sensitive to any kind of geopolitical tension in the Middle East because it's a net oil importer. So investors are really looking at the repercussions of what this is going to mean, because we don't know how long this war is going to last, and also waiting to see you know, whether the Strait of Hormuz is going to see some vessels passing through. But we also saw the Nikkei in Japan dropping around 3.6%, and this is a very negative handover for the European markets. We saw the US markets, you know, losing 1,000 points at one point during the day. They only closed much softer. That's after President Trump's announcement. But there are major jitters, and people are very worried. Investors are crunching the numbers because what we didn't anticipate was a strike on critical infrastructure in the region. On the energy front, we didn't anticipate strikes here in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, as well as Dubai, which of course we've seen in other parts of the region as well. That all having a ripple effect because investors are too scared to park their money into, you know, stocks at this point. You're seeing a rally in the gold price today after softness yesterday and purchasing of the US dollar.
Eleni, thank you, and thank you for watching the last 3 hours, an extraordinary 3 hours here on The Story Is. The news continues. My colleague Rosemary Church standing by here in studio. You'll see her right after this.